In addition to ultraviolet radiation, it's also possible to use ionizing radiation in the control of microbial growth. Ionizing radiation is at the far end of the electromagnetic radiation scale. These are forms of radiation that have such a short wavelength that they are very, very energetic, very powerful, and capable of passing straight through living materials. What the ionizing radiation is doing as it passes through cells is it is literally knocking electrons out of orbit. If you recall from our biochemistry lecture, every atom inside your body is surrounded by a cloud of electrons arranged in various shells around the atomic nucleus. When an ionizing ray comes through, it can knock electrons out of orbit around that atomic nucleus and leave that atom with unpaired electrons. That atom is now unstable. When you hit certain molecules, things like water and oxygen gas, with ionizing radiation, the types of molecules that are created when electrons are knocked out of orbit are referred to as radicals, free radicals. You may have heard of these. The problem with the generation of free radicals in living tissue is that those molecules, because they are unstable, they will seek out to steal, essentially, to take electrons from other atoms. And that process can damage and even kill cells. So, ionizing radiation has its place in the control of microbial growth, but it is a much more dangerous form of radiation for the people who are using it, for the people that might be exposed to it. Unlike ultraviolet radiation, ionizing radiation has excellent penetration. So it could absolutely penetrate through layers of materials, whereas ultraviolet radiation cannot. Ionizing radiation is used to sterilize, not just disinfect. It's often applied to surgical instruments, particularly right after they've been manufactured, before they're shipped to the hospitals and doctors' offices. Ionizing radiation works well in sterilizing plastic labware after it has been manufactured. Drugs, pharmaceutical compounds, even foods, things like produce and meat is often exposed to ionizing radiation, particularly foods that are coming in across borders from other countries, where handling procedures may not be quite as strict, packaging procedures and so on may not be quite as strict. So we apply the ionizing radiation at customs checkpoints to ensure that those foods are not carrying dangerous pathogens with them. Now, the biggest problem with the use of ionizing radiation for the control of microbes is public perception. The public, generally speaking, does not like the use of ionizing radiation on their food. There is a mistaken belief in the public that a thing, an item that becomes irradiated is now radioactive. In other words, the public fears that if their fruit or produce coming in from another country is subject to irradiation, that means that that fruit or that meat is now radioactive and dangerous to them. This, of course, is not true. Unfortunately, the public in general, again, does not understand how radiation works. And so it has not been a particularly popular method for controlling the growth of microbes on foods. And again, it is primarily used on things that are coming in from other countries. The last physical method for controlling the growth of microbes that we're going to be discussing is filtration. Filtration is used in particular for certain heat-sensitive liquids and for various industrial gases. Filtration involves passing those liquids and gases through a filter material, a material that has pores in it that will allow the liquid or the gas to pass through, but will trap microbial cells. Filtration is an inexpensive way to control the growth of microbes. It is an easy process to perform, but it has limitations. And its largest limitation is the size of the pores that are available in the commercial filters. The smallest commercial filter pore size that's available is 0.2 micrometers or 200 nanometers. So as you can imagine, that pore will trap bacterial cells. It will trap archaeal cells. It will trap any eukaryotic microbe, but it will not trap viruses. Viral particles can pass through a pore of that size. On this slide, there are a whole lot of mask filters. And we are certainly living in a time when we've all become more familiar with these masks than maybe we would like to be. Up at the top here, this mask right here is called an N95 respirator. This is a mask that is commonly used in healthcare settings to filter the air that a person is breathing. The N95 also comes in forms commercially that are intended for people that work around a lot of dust or a lot of particulate material in the air. So construction workers, painters, and so on will wear N95 respirators to help protect themselves from things in the air. Not necessarily microbial cells, but other particulate matter. During this pandemic, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, one of the biggest problems that we had on the healthcare front was the availability of N95 respirators. And very quickly, we ran out of the stockpiles that we had available in this country. And of course, in today's world, most of these mask products are not produced here in the United States. They're made in China. So there were some supply issues. In fact, we are still having supply issues in terms of these N95 respirators. When you look at a mask like this one over here on the left, this is also a very commonly encountered mask in the healthcare field. This is what's called a surgical mask. This is the kind of mask that a surgeon would put over his or her face in the operating room, a surgeon and all the other personnel that would be in the operating room. This mask is not the same as an N95 respirator. This mask is not going to filter out nearly as well as this is. This mask, in fact, is primarily intended to protect the patient on the operating room from things that might be expelled from the wearer's mouth and nose during the surgical procedure. If you look down here, this person is wearing a surgical mask and a face shield. This has also become a common sight during the pandemic we're in, as have these completely enclosed face masks over here. And of course, as we all know, a lot of people out in public, a lot of the lay public, are wearing simple cloth masks now over their mouth and nose in an effort to mitigate the spread of the novel coronavirus. The reason I put all these images together for us is because I want to remind us that, as with a lot of other things we've been talking about, it's important that you know what the capabilities of a mask are. If you're going to put it to use, trying to control your exposure to microbes. These N95 respirators are extremely effective. They can filter out virtually all bacteria, but they are not protective against all viral particles. And that's because the pore size is simply too large to do that. So while they are certainly very helpful at protecting the wearer from many of the pathogenic microbes that they might encounter in their workplace, they are not 100% protective against particularly viral particles passing through the mask. You've probably heard people saying during this pandemic that when we wear a mask, even a simple cloth mask like this one, when we wear a mask, the mask is going to protect the other person more than it protects us. So that is an absolutely true statement. What the mask is doing primarily for this woman is it is stopping respiratory droplets that she is expelling from her mouth and nose as she breathes and talks and maybe coughs or sneezes. The material is solid enough to capture those respiratory droplets and any viral particles that might be in those respiratory droplets. And we have come to understand that the primary means of transmission of this novel coronavirus is through respiratory droplets. In other words, this is not a virus that spreads all by itself in the air. It's not a truly aerosolized particle. This particle is primarily transmitted in little droplets of water or fluid that are coming out of the mouth and the nose, again, as people talk and as they cough and sneeze and maybe sing or yell. They're spreading viral particles that way. So it is possible to increase the effectiveness of one of these masks by adding an impenetrable plastic shield. Obviously, this shield is going to stop some viral particles before they reach the mask over this person's mouth and nose. The other reason that shields are helpful when we're trying to protect ourselves from viral particles is that viral particles, respiratory viruses, their particles can not only come into our bodies through our mouth and through our nose, but also through our eyes. You have to recall from your anatomy that the saline, the tears that bathe your eyes, are going to circulate. They're going to drain out through your lacrimal duct, and that fluid will then empty through the eustachian tubes into the back of your pharynx. So yes, if a respiratory virus, if its particles get into your eyes, it's possible for them to be swept away with the tears down into the back of your throat, where they can bind to cells and cause disease. So adding the face shield in terms of our particular pandemic virus that we're living with right now adds another layer of protection, but again, not 100% by any means. Remember that the only way to protect yourself from a respiratory viral pathogen, 100% protection, is to use the kind of PPE that we see in BSL-4 laboratories. Remember, 100% protection requires complete containment. And if you recall, when we were talking about biosafety level PPE, these suits that you see worn in BSL-4 labs, They are 100% contained. They have their own separate supply of air for breathing, separate from the room air. And of course, the head, the face, and the rest of the body are completely isolated from the rest of the room. So the only way to achieve 100% protection from the novel coronavirus would be for everybody to walk around in one of these suits, which is obviously not practical and would never happen. However, even though we're not achieving 100% protection, it's very important that we use these facial coverings because it has been shown absolutely to decrease the spread of this particular respiratory pathogen. You don't have to wear a full N95 either. A simple paper surgical mask or a homemade fabric mask is enough to greatly mitigate the transmission of this terrible coronavirus. Unfortunately, we're living in a time when the use of masks as a public health measure has become politicized. And so I'm sure you've seen that there are protests going on, there are people showing up at public meetings to complain about the use of masks. There are people out there who think that the mask infringes on their freedom. There are people out there who think that the mask doesn't work. There are people who think that the mask is somehow dangerous to them. And of course, there are even some people who don't believe the virus is real. Unfortunately, as we've moved through these past couple of months, we have not done a very good job as a public health community. We have not done a very good job educating people about why we need to wear masks when we're out in public. But I am encouraged when I see posters and advertisements and things on social media that look like what you're looking at on this slide. This came out of a particular hospital system. They were posting these in and around their facilities to show people why the use of masks is so important. And as you can see, what they've drawn on this poster is the probability of transmission of the virus that causes COVID-19, depending upon who's got a mask on and who doesn't. So of course, if the person who has the virus does not have a mask on and they encounter another person, a healthy person without a mask, the probability of transmission is quite high, as we know. How high, you might ask? Well, our most current data suggests that this virus has what's called an R naught of about 3 to 4. Now, R naught is simply a measurement, a designation of how transmissible a particular pathogen is. And the number, the 3 to 4 number, means that for every person who has the novel coronavirus, who's infected with that virus, they are likely to pass it on to 3 or 4 other people. Now, for comparison, the common cold has an R naught of about 1. And the influenza virus has an R naught of 2. So this novel coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is highly transmissible, much more transmissible even than the flu. Now, in the second drawing, you can see the on the left, again, a person who's infected with SARS-CoV-2 and doesn't wear a mask, coming in contact with a healthy person who has a mask on. We still have a moderately high transmission probability here. If the person who's got the virus has a mask on and they encounter another person without a mask, now we've dropped the transmission down to much lower levels. And of course, if both people have a mask on, the transmission probability drops down to very low. It's really important as we move forward during this time, during this pandemic, that we wear masks over our mouth and our nose any time that we are in public and likely to contact other people. It will help decrease the transmission of this virus, and thus it will decrease the number of cases of COVID-19, the number of hospitalizations, and ultimately the number of deaths. Take a look at the video on the slide. This is some imaging that was done by a company to show the flow of air around a person's face when they are both not wearing a mask and when they are wearing a mask. This imaging helps to show us why masks are effective at preventing the transmission of viral particles that travel in respiratory droplets. So look over here on the left-hand side. As this man speaks and breathes, you can see these jets of air coming out of his nose and his mouth. He's coughing here. Notice that the air, as indicated in purple, is always moving. Air currents are always traveling around us. But as he speaks and sneezes and coughs, he is expelling material out into those currents. That material will then be swept up in those currents, and any other person that's in the area will be exposed. Now look on the right-hand side. When he puts a mask on, you can still see air currents around him because, of course, the air is always moving. But as he talks and as he sneezes and coughs and so on, we don't see the jettison of respiratory droplets. We don't see the jettison of air that we see over here on the left-hand side. I think these flow imaging techniques are so helpful in showing people why masking is so important right now. On this slide, we've also got some imaging going on. This is the visualization for a cough jet. They've got essentially a mechanized human head over here with smoke that is expelled from the mouth and nose during a simulated cough and sneeze. You can see that the smoke travels quite a distance when this person expels air through a cough or a sneeze. And when you add in the lighting, you can see that not only does it swirl and mix in with air currents, but it travels, again, an amazing distance, 1.5 meters away. I mean, that's quite startling. This is why social distancing is also an important piece in the prevention of the transmission of the COVID-19 virus. So as we continue to live during this pandemic, we continue to learn about the importance of filtration in the control of microbes. Not so much in the control of their growth here, but certainly in the control of their transmission from person to person. And as with all control methods, we have to know what they're capable of doing and know what they're not capable of doing. The last thing we'll talk about today is chemical methods of controlling microbial growth. We're not going to get deep into this topic in lecture. We will be talking about it in detail during an upcoming laboratory period. For today, I want us to be familiar with the fact that there are many chemicals available to us on the market that are designed to help us control microbes in our environment. Most common are 4 big families of chemicals and I want us to be familiar with these. Those families include alcohols, chlorinated compounds, and by that I'm referring to bleach, what are called iodophores, and quaternary ammonium compounds. These are the four big classes of chemical disinfectants that are most commonly used. These are not the only classes of chemicals that are available, but again, these are the ones you will most commonly encounter out in healthcare environments and in other industrial locations. Some of these chemicals are capable of sterilization if they're used at a high enough concentration and they're left in contact with the surface for a long enough period of time. Some of them can even destroy spores. We're going to be focusing on these common chemicals when they are used as disinfectants, however, when they're used in an effort to eliminate pathogenic microbes from surfaces. So I'm going to provide for you a summary table of these four types of chemical disinfectant: alcohols, the chlorinated compounds, the iodophores, and the quaternary ammonium compounds. In that table, you'll be provided with how these chemicals work, what mechanism of action they have, in other words, what their advantages are, what their disadvantages are, all of the basic things that we need to know so that when we reach for a chemical disinfectant, again, we'll know what it can do and what it can't do, and what concerns we should have if we're going to choose to use it.